Benjamin made this beat.
Come on. I need a data center in my neighborhood. I want a data center in my town. Please put a data center in my neighborhood. That way, my rent might actually go down. I don't care about the noise. I'm out here getting hearing damage with the boys. Maybe I could get lung damage too. Just so you can ask Rock, is this true? I don't need electricity. My bill going up isn't scary to me, not at all. No, my biggest fear is losing ChatGPT. I don't need my water to be clean. Line goes up when I look at my screen. Rent goes up like year after year, every year. Hey, data center, get over here. I need a data center in my neighborhood. I want a data center in my town. Please put a data center in my neighborhood. That way, my rent might actually go down. I need a data center in my house.
I'm ready. I put away all my pickle tabs.
Put away my childish things. My pickle tabs.
No. I'm picking up the childish things.
Picking up my childish things.
Get back to my adult things later.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony. You can't do data-driven cube edits if you never do cube edits-matics.
That's true. No argument for me.
Cube Cobra has a brand new feature, brand new-ish at the time of recording, that I feel like is not going to be that useful to you, but I did make you use it a little bit because I wanted you to be informed for this conversation. And the feature allows you to upload draft reports, which are basically, combinations of deck lists and records, including matchups like who beat who and by how many games, and then basically put those into your Cube Cobra profile on your cube and then do analysis on that data. Now, most of us, I think, you and I included, do not keep such detailed records for our local cubes and our local playgroup. If we play locally, I'll get a record. I'll know this deck went 3-0, but I won't know who it played and what round and what that other deck's record was. I just know what decks are 3-0s. And some people don't bother to post pictures of their decks in the Discord, and that's fine. It's not a requirement. But we both had a lot of cubes at Hedron Network Run Events. That is a software that Gwen built to run all these sort of local cube events. And if you don't know, you can just, create an account for Hedron Network and go and look up the results of any cube that has been in a Hedron Network event. You can see all the deck photos, all the records and everything. It's just public information based on the cube ID. So if you ever want to do a deep dive on a cube that's been in a lot of Hedron Network events, you can do so. And Gwen provides a JSON export you can then import into Cube Cobra each draft and then go through this pretty sophisticated interface that allows you to try and automatically parse card names out of photos and identify them. You can make corrections and then actually correct all the deck lists, and then it has all the associated records and you can create the draft objects that way.
I've definitely seen a handful of people that will, every time they draft their cube in paper, transcribe every single person's deck and then record the record for that. And it does let you do some interesting analysis. You can just look at, here's this pool of cards, and you can say, well, this particular card was in a winning deck 60% of the time, whereas this particular card was never in a winning deck, and that might tell you something. But that is so much work. So really what Gwen has done by, doing this integration between Cube Cobra and Hedron Network is, if you've already had cubes at events where all that record information is absolutely kept in a way that you didn't have to do the work, and there's all the deck photos, hopefully more on that, I'm sure, you can, in this semi-automated way, just generate a whole bunch of data that, if you're the kind of person that's interested in driving your cube in that way, of thinking about what are cards that are underperforming or overperforming or working together, and what are the different types of deck themes that are coming together, there's a lot to be seen here.
There's definitely a lot, and I want to talk about what can be gleaned from this information, at least from my perspective, and obviously, your mileage may vary as your own cube owner, but I think we're in an interesting position in that we do have cubes that are at a lot of these events, and there are 39 entire drafts worth of data on Hedron Network about 100 Ornithopters, which is the cube that I am most invested in designing right now and thinking about the most. And I got a little bee in my bonnet over the weekend and was like, you know what, I'm going to start importing these so that I can at least see what this interface is all about, because, aside from the few true blue sickos that are like you said, doing all that manual labor on every single cube draft and documenting this stuff themselves, most people don't have this much data about their cube. And so if someone's going to do it, might as well be someone that has a lot of data about it. And I want to talk about kind of approaching this with a grain of salt to sort of figure out what you can really learn from this and what you maybe should avoid trying to take away from this data, because it might lack the depth or specificity that you could, glean specific information from.
To be clear, all of the tracking stuff does still work even if you haven't had a cube in an event run by Hedron Network. So
Correct.
If you do have have your, like we have our local Discord channel for every single cube that we play, and people will generally post, here's a picture of my deck and what the record was. So if you have that, or if you want to start like asking players to do that, then you can definitely keep doing this, and you just have to manually enter the player records as well.
Yeah, there actually is a feature where you can, as part of the draft, which I think we should do tonight, you can actually just like post a link and players can upload their deck photos directly to this link, as well as
really cool.
report their match results, so that not only do you know which deck was 3-0, but you know that it beat these 3 other players or whatever, which is one of the interesting things that this provides that is something I don't really have a sense of. Like, a lot of what this has done is confirm things that like I already sort of knew or suspected. And one of the things that I hadn't really given a ton of thought to is this like big archetype matchup matrix, which kind of tells you, where certain decks are beating other ones and, by what percentages. So that's a cool layer of information that you actually probably don't have. And most people I know that have like tracked their data don't track the full match history. They just track records. So they have their like 3-0 deck list, their 2-1 deck list, but not which decks they beat on their way. So I should say too, a couple of things at the front here. The very first article ever on Lucky Paper, the reason for the website coming to exist was an article written by our friend Jet, who basically wrote about this exact thing, the idea of taking your draft data and trying to like glean statistically relevant information from it to inform cube design. And it's largely a detailed treatise on why you should be very circumspect about doing any of that, and how anything that can seem like a card win rate is actually just attributable to whatever decks that card happens to be good in. And so you shouldn't take like overperformance of a specific card to mean that card is good, just that that card gets played in good decks, which means something pretty subtly but saliently different. So we'll link to that in the show notes. I think it's required reading for anybody that cares about using data to learn from their cube, and it certainly is coloring my sort of perspective on how I'm looking at this win rate analysis in Cube Cobra.
The win rate analysis doesn't provide like anything with a value judgment. Like, it's saying, here's what happened, but then what you might choose to do with that, if anything, is based on, what your own goals, and comes with a lot of indirection. Like you said, you might look at that and just say, oh, this card way overperforms, but maybe it's just because there are other cards surrounding it that make it really good. So if you wanted to tune it down, there are probably multiple ways you could actually approach that.
Yeah, memory serves, I think in the article, Jet uses the example of Jackal Pup versus Ancestral Recall, and it's like, Jackal Pup has a higher win rate. Does it mean it's better card than Ancestral Recall? It sure as shit doesn't.
Sure sounds like it to me.
It's definitely not. It's just that the mono-red aggressive decks in Jet's Cube for a long time were just very successful. They were not that complicated to pilot, and you were going to get the Jackal Pup in that deck pretty safely. So it wasn't going to end up in somebody else's deck that's doing whatever.
But
meanwhile,
the Ancestral Recall is going to end up in the black-red player's deck because they talk themselves into their like 3 blue sources being enough,
right,
and ends up not being great.
Or it's just played in a variety. Any deck that can cast it will play it, whether even if it's on color.
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
And so like if the blue decks maybe are really strong as control decks, but they're not as good as like mid-range decks, but your green-blue mid-range deck is still going to jam Ancestral Recall. Like, there's a lot of conflating of information that I think we should acknowledge at the front here, is that like anything mathematical or numerical or analytical in this way has the sort of aesthetics of truth and objectivity, because you see it written out as a percentage with like, 2 decimal places. It like feels like, well, this is precise and exact. And it is exact, but what it precisely is convoluted and oftentimes not clear. And so just the very nature of like making a table here that has, like all of the cards and their match win percentage, like saying that this is the card's match win percentage, is a complicated thing that you should not just shorthand to, well, this is a strong card because it has a high match win percentage, because that's not really how any of this works, which I'm sure we're going to get into in detail.
Another part maybe I would emphasize from that article of Jets is just that even if you do all of that like incredible labor, you're still collecting a pretty small data set. So for most players, regardless of how much work you're doing, you're not necessarily getting like a statistically relevant set of data. I think you're maybe approaching something that we can definitely like bring some narratives out of, because I mean, you did this mostly for 100 Ornithopters, correct?
That's all I've done it for, yeah.
And you have, it seemed like more than a dozen like full drafts, which represents a whole bunch of matches.
At time of recording, I have 25 full drafts, which is 198 decks and all of the corresponding, match results, but some players dropped after a couple rounds, so it's not necessarily, that many decks times 3 match results.
Right, and I just did this for 2 full drafts from Hedron Network, and so many of the cards just like did not appear. Like, they were only in sideboards, or like players didn't upload a deck pick, so weren't included. So 2 drafts, nowhere near enough to really start getting analysis. It's like enough I can see what all the graphs look like and how things work, but I'm not trusting that green sucks in this cube just based on those 2 drafts.
Yeah, I guess another big caveat at the top is the software that Gwen wrote to help analyze these deck pictures is, like I said, pretty sophisticated. Overall, it works quite well. It is not perfect, and more importantly, the source data is not perfect. I don't have deck list photos for a lot of these pools, so a lot of them are just the entire pool is the quote-unquote deck list, which I tried like once or twice.
Did you actually include the whole pool, or were you trying... Like, the three options there would be ignore it completely, add all of the cards as a deck, or try to fit it together into a deck yourself based on your
fourth
assumptions.
option, which is there's a checkbox you can do in the interface that says, "What the bots build this deck for me," which
secret fourth bot option,
which I tried a couple times with 100 Ornithopters, and at least with my cube, 100 Ornithopters, it did a terrible job
can imagine,
of actually building a deck, and so I immediately stopped doing that. In some cases, I have tried to do my best to make obvious cuts. Like, here's an off-color card, or 3 off-color cards that, like, there's clearly no way you're playing, but then I'm left with, like, what I think is probably a 45 card deck list, adding basic lands that I don't know what of these on-color cards you cut. I just leave them all in the main deck and say, like, well, let's assume they're all in there, basically, and it's not going to, like, affect the archetype analysis dramatically. And if that card was on-color and available in your sideboard, it's also kind of in your deck. You could have played it in matches that, mattered, so it's kind of, a thing that counts. I didn't bother doing that for deck lists or, pools that did not have a particularly good record, so, like, I was less interested in, like, having them to refer back to as, like, successful decks.
That, I think you're introducing some major bias, and I think that might be another source
I think it's a pretty minor bias, but...
I think that might be another, if I'm talking about, like, going through our Discord and tracking, I think it's much more likely people are posting their decks for winning decks, or their picture for winning decks, because they're excited. Like, here's my 3-0, here's my 2-1. When somebody goes 0-3, they're often like, it's not, like, I didn't even take a deck photo because it sucked. And I think that...
To be clear, I'm still entering them all. I'm just not spending the time to, like, here's what I think the main deck probably was, if there wasn't a deck picture. And I would say probably there's deck pictures for 80%, 75% of the decks I've uploaded for 100 Ornithopters, and the rest are just pool photos. And in the vast majority of those cases, I've just left the entire pool in the deck, which I think is pretty indistinguishable. In 100 Ornithopters, I have not gone through and made sure the exact Ornithopter count was right in every deck, mostly because there's no way to analyze that whatsoever on this page, so getting them right doesn't affect anything, and also because it's particularly annoying because in deck photos, people would oftentimes just, like, put an Ornithopter with a dice on top, and then the automatic thing only finds one Ornithopter and have to manually add them one by one, and it's super annoying. I don't want to do it. That's one thing I also didn't get correct. And also, a lot of the deck photos I imported correctly, and it was 38 cards. And I'm like, I'm looking, I got them all. This is not your deck, obviously, or you played an illegal deck. So, like, there's a lot of asterisks on this before we even get to any of the actual results. Like, is there enough data to be statistically significant? No. Is the data particularly good and consistent? No. Are there going to be biases in who took a deck photo versus who didn't? Absolutely. Are there biases in how the deck were imported? In my case, a little bit. Like, I'm trying to get correct 3-0 deck list as much as I can. Everything beyond that, I'm just letting it, the pieces fall where they may. These are all big asterisks on any of the stuff we're about to talk about because there's going to be noise in these data sets because of these reasons.
Can I be a bad guy for a second?
Yeah,
I'm just going to become an evil person right now and just ask people, why? If you're at an event run by Hedron Network, there's an option, the check-in and check-out photos are required because that is necessary for making sure cards don't go missing. There's another field for uploading your deck list photo. The cube designers all ask for it. Why would you ever not do that? Every single player I see lays out their deck just to build the deck. Why would you not stop and take that extra second? Like, is that really such a huge burden? It's so frustrating.
So, I hear you. I will also say, as somebody who at KubeCon DMB could not get my phone to upload anything on the cell service,
that's okay.
I know for a fact I didn't upload some deck photos because I had to have a judge literally come over and upload anything for me manually. And so I would have done it, except I had no cell service in that stupid building, and they didn't give free Wi-Fi to anybody unless you were staying in the hotel. So that's one example of a reason why people not have deck photos is like if that's a problem or they're worried about the battery life in their phone or they're trying to upload the bare minimum so they're like, you're not, taxing their device too much. I can imagine practical reasons why you would not do it. But I think most of the time it's not there is because players just didn't care.
Don't come to the defense of these players that just don't care. And I think that that's underscored for me based on just the quality of these deck photos is often abominable.
Yeah, pretty bad.
The people laying the stacks of cards, and sorry, this is not really germane to this conversation, but I just would want to encourage people to take good deck photos, and the ones where people stack up cards horizontally, so you just see the first 3 letters of the card.
It's worst.
That's not useful. Don't do that. Just stack up the cards so you can see the whole card name.
You can. I can. To be fair, as a human, if you're... Before this tab existing, there was nothing to do with this stuff other than look at it with your human eyeballs. And so I can parse that deck list just as fast as I can parse a deck list that's stacked up normally. It's particularly bad for this particular interface. So yeah, I think maybe honestly people might change if they know that these are actually being used somewhere and not just getting thrown into some repository or AWS bucket and never looked at again. So here's a note for us saying that they are being used by us and other cube designers.
Take a nice deck picture. Just care a little bit. Just make the edges neat.
I do like making the edges neat. I think the other reason is oftentimes people basically forget to do a deck photo at the beginning because they got excited and shuffled up, and then just be eager to be done once the draft is over.
But that, again, is I think where like that's a potential major source of bias that I think people are like, oh, here's my 3-0 deck pick. I want to take a picture of this versus, it sucked anyway. There's no point. I think that's like a pretty major bias.
It is, but the question then becomes, okay, how much of a bias is it to just not have the cards taken out of the sideboard as far as this like bot analysis of these deck archetypes goes? And I don't know. Maybe significant. I thought because a fair number of my, maybe 20% of all the decks I uploaded were just full pools, I thought for sure I would get a lot of 4 and 5 color decks that are not really that. I'm looking at time of recording, I have, like I said, uploaded 25 draft records, and so basically 200 decks. Of those, only 2 or 5 color, according to this sort of bot analysis, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 13. There's 4 to 5 of the 4 color decks that are missing 1 color, basically. But most of the decks are 2 or 3 color, which sounds about right to me. Like, that matches my expectations for what I would anticipate this data to be. So, I don't know, maybe the bots are doing a better job of also just saying, man, these cards are kind of off color, so we're going to assume this is not really part of the defining archetype of this deck.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that overall, I'm very comfortable working with data that is very concrete and sort of like, here are the number of times this card was in a winning deck. I understand what that analysis means. I think that overall, obviously, in the world, there's changes in the way that computers work, and there's a lot of sort of in-between steps of, well, we've taken this deck and we've processed it and figured out it is a Selesnya deck, and done, all these complicated heuristics to figure out, well, were these 3 blue cards actually, relevant? Is that, crossing the threshold to say it's a Bant deck? That's just, a change in thinking about data that's a little bit difficult for me because I'm used to thinking in those much more concrete terms.
This is all very soft. You got to embrace the softness and the blurriness of the edges, and there's a lot of automatic stuff here to determine what the deck archetypes are.
Exactly, yeah. Which tells such a more compelling narrative that I think is going to be accessible to so many more people, but it is a little bit more separated from just the hard statistics.
Yeah, for example, and we're going to talk extensively about the results page for 100 Ornithopters just because I've uploaded 200 deck lists. You can do the same for your own cubes, or you can actually go and look at this page as well, which by the time this episode comes out, I will have even more deck lists updated. So if you see different numbers than we're talking about here, that's why I've added more data. But at the time of recording, the winningest deck by percentage is what the bots call WUG Bant Ramp, which is funny because I would not say anything in this cube qualifies as a ramp deck. Some decks have Tolarian Academy or Gaia's Cradle or Springleaf Drum. That's the ramp, basically, that's available in this cube. But I would never call any of these decks a ramp deck. And if you look at the actual staples and identity cards for this deck, it is clear that is the control deck. The control deck so often is blue splashing white and green in some combination for disenchants and, card advantage. What it's calling WUG ramp or Bant ramp is actually Bant Control is the highest win percentage deck in the data set that we're looking at.
Okay, but that's an interesting point, is that you can go very deep in a lot of these visualizations, which, if something says, here it's a certain archetype, you can actually figure out, okay, let me do a little extra interpretation of what I think that means in this particular context, and because you have access to all the details to drill into, you're able to do that, and you're not just reliant on what that label is.
I think we should just kind of go in order on this page and talk about what, if anything, we can glean from each of these graphs, just kind of in order. The first thing at the top here is just win rate by color. And if you hover over this little information box, it says match win rate of cards in each color weighted by how often they're played. Each card counts towards every color in its identity. So a gold card lifts all of its colors versus the cube average. So 400 Ornithopters, green and white are the winningest colors, but only by a slight margin, 52% and 52.3 and 51.6% win rate for green and white. So slightly above average. So I should say, because of draws, 50% is not the average. The average is 48.6. So that's actually 3 and 4 points respectively above the average win rate for the cube, but still nothing crazy. Blue is right about at the average win rate. Red is a tiny bit below. Colorless, there's not any colorless decks. I don't know. I mean, this is
it's still the individual colorless cards' contribution to win rate,
I suppose.
Which is again why I'm thinking,
which is weird to think about because the green cards end up in the same decks very often. So to say green has a higher win rate is useful because you have to put those cards in the same deck. The colorless cards end up by definition in any deck they want. I would expect that to be basically exactly the average. It's a little below average. I don't know what to make of that. But the real notable thing here is that the black cards have a substantially lower win rate. So 43.8 compared to the base win rate of the cube of 48.6, which is somewhat notable and brings up another big sort of asterisk and caveat to this data, which is that this page only shows you analytics based off of cards in the current cube list.
Oh, that's a good note.
It does not include any cards that were documented in deck lists but have since been removed from the cube. I just did an update where I removed Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and Imperial Seal, probably some of the best black cards that have ever been in this cube. Inquisition of Kozilek and Thoughtseize were in this cube for a long time. Those were incredibly powerful cards. Any cards those were in winning deck lists of are essentially not contributing to this percentage, which is only to say that that's a thing to be aware of, because this is kind of the same point, right? Like, even if those are really good cards, the black decks are not winning. So I think if they were here, maybe the win rate would be a tiny bit better or something, because they're going to pull things up a tiny bit. But overall, those deck lists are not winning. So it's more like those cards are going to have a low win rate, and you're going to be like, these must be bad cards, even though we know intellectually and logically they are not bad cards.
Okay, that is actually a really important note, because if somebody was trying to do like a data-driven approach and looking at this graph and saying, I want all these numbers to be balanced. I mean, I feel like that's what so many cube designers say.
Talk about, yeah.
When they say, I want my cube to be balanced, they would like all of these to be 50% or, 48.6% in this case. But that's a good note. If you're trying to do that in like a really strict way, as soon as you remove a card, it's going to change all these graphs because of that quirk of the analysis. So you're kind of not quite operating on the data in the way you think you are.
I think it's worth talking about, like, should balance even be a goal here? Like, I think we can agree it's not achievable. Even if you were to, like, in theory have achieved it, you'd never be able to do enough drafts to measure and confirm it. As far as I'm concerned, like, these are all within a boundary of playable. Like, a 4 points, 5 points below the average win percentage is like not so much that black is like wildly unplayable and you shouldn't touch it. And it does conform with my expectations for the cube. I've said for a long time, I think the decks that struggle the most are the like sacrifice combo decks. And I've been asked before why there's no Grave Hate in the cube. And the reason I've always given is because those decks are already struggling, and they do not need to contend with Grave Hate in this environment, because it would punish them and basically only them, and they're already struggling. And the data has, shown this to be basically the case. That we'll get into more detail about deck archetypes, but the black decks that are really struggling are the ones that are trying to do some big graveyard-based recursion combo where they're getting back all their Ornithopters with, Echoing Return and playing them a bunch of times with like Jaws of Defeat or whatever. And there's a couple trophy deck lists that have done it, but on average, those decks are, I think, falling over themselves more than they are succeeding.
There's another quirk about this particular cube, which is that you have so many colorless cards. You have a bunch of Ornithopters in your deck, which means effectively the unique cards in your deck is a much smaller pool, right? So I wonder, going back to that example of you just removed 3 powerful black cards, which means they're no longer being factored into this analysis, which, on some level that does make a lot of sense. Like, this is about the current state of the cube. But could you even imagine that there were a bunch of winning decks that all had those 3 powerful black cards that were like a critical part of their plan, but now that those cards are no longer factored in the analysis, they're not even being registered as black decks anymore because those cards aren't factored in. So it could be that black was very effective because of those cards, and it's now just this quirk of people haven't like adapted to drafting black a new way or like found the useful thing to do with it. So it looks like black is doing much worse here.
I don't know to what degree cards not in the current list aren't included. My impression was that they just weren't included in the summary data, but not that it would be taken away from like determining the deck identity.
Okay, got it.
Is my impression.
Because we could still like there's lots of tables in here, and there's specific tables of like, let's look at the win rate of any card.
You cannot look at a card that is not in the cube.
Sure.
In that table, and based on the way that this information box is describing this graph, I'm assuming that this does not include cards that are not currently in the cube, because I think it's just a sum of the values in that graph below, in that table below, basically. Anyway, so I think that's somewhat useful, and like, I think knowing vaguely what colors are most successful in your cube and treating this as anecdotal, right? Like, I'm not treating this as like green and white are the best colors, just that I see them be successful a lot, and that's true to my like lived experience too. I think that's useful. I kind of knew black was struggling for a while, so I'm not surprised by any of that, and all of that also falls within like perfectly fine boundaries to me to be like relatively satisfied with how things are going.
Right. It's also very worth noting that this particular style of graph, I mean, this is just sort of a data visualization best practices, is always kind of normalized to what the range of data is. So I put in the 2 drafts of regular cube and have a pretty big spread of, green winning 40% and black winning 60%. That is pretty extreme, but in those 2 drafts, a black deck happened to 3-0. So it's like,
you would expect
a pretty
that
narrow.
If you added a bunch more data, that would start to narrow down a little bit.
But then I looked over at the Ornithopters data, and it's like, the graph looks kind of the same.
Yes.
But it's very important to look at those numbers.
At the scale.
Look at what the scale is, because it's not a difference of 40%, it's a difference of 10%, which is much, much smaller.
The next 2 graphs are basically the exact same things, but instead of by color, it's by card type. So like Planeswalker, land, creature, and by mana value. I don't really think there's almost anything to glean from this. The fact that Planeswalker and Battle are so high in the win by card type in this cube is just because there's so few there's only 1 Battle, and it's a pretty good card and a pretty good color, so it has a high win percentage. And there's not that many Planeswalkers either. I already know the Planeswalkers I include are good. I'm not sure what to make of this, and I can't imagine ever really getting any like useful cube design meat off of this bone. Like the first graph about the color win rate, I've been reconsidering adding requisition rate back to this cube for a variety of reasons I won't go into now, but suffice it to say that would be a like big power outlier in white. And knowing that not only is like white by my sort of, anecdotal impression a strong color, but statistically based on, Hedron network drafts, a pretty successful color, that does make me think, do I really need another power outlier in white? Like that does sort of start to affect my cube design a little bit. Whereas I probably wouldn't blink at adding like another power outlier in black, for example, because it's like, these decks are already struggling. If they can give them a powerful card to help them, I wouldn't hesitate. I can't imagine being like, well, I'm not going to add another Planeswalker because the Planeswalkers are bad or whatever. So not sure what to make of the card type or mana value graphs either. I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to take away from this in terms of how this actually impacts my cube design.
I mean, I totally agree, and I think that in some specific cubes, you could definitely draw some narrative from this. Like, if you specifically have an enchantment theme, or an artifact theme, or potentially even a planeswalker theme, you could see how those are performing.
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
But in most cubes, more decks are playing just like a mixture of different card types in a way which is very different from most cubes are not playing just like everybody's playing 5-color soup. So like the difference between colors feels much more meaningful to me than card types outside of those specific examples.
And this is a good example of like, and no disrespect to Gwen at all, who is doing a great service to the community and not getting paid nearly enough for all the work that goes into Cube Cobra. But this is a great example of like, you can make the graphs, but should you? Like, is it useful? And I would argue probably not for almost any cube, but that's why we're talking about this page in a whole episode, because I think some of these graphs can be useful, and some of them it's like, well, yeah, the data's there. You can make this graph. It's easy to make it. That doesn't necessarily mean you can learn anything from it.
The mana value, I think, is more interesting, and I think I would just have to look at that for a whole bunch of different cubes to start to feel some conclusions. But if I saw a lot of cubes where it's like, yeah, this is pretty even, I might start to think, okay, that's like a reasonable distribution, versus if I see like the 5-drops and 6-drops are doing terribly. I mean, there's kind of two hypotheses I might apply to that. One is that the cube is more aggressive than I intended to, and I really want people to be able to play their Inferno Titan and have that be good. Or it might just be that there are too many of them, and so they're ending up in decks that feel a little bit wonky, and that's why it's not working. It is a very indirect, and there's so much context, but I mean, maybe that's also just another opportunity to be like, here's something that seems weird. The 6-drops are doing terrible. Let me go look at specific decks, or like talk to people and like ask about the gameplay experience and see if I can come up with some better narratives.
Well, I think that's another example too of how this is all kind of fraught, because I don't know about you, but if I were to look like the Bun Magic cube, anything that costs more than 3 mana probably has some alternate cost, some cost reduction mechanic. Like Treasure Cruise is not actually a sign that 8-drops are great in that cube,
Or maybe it is, and you just need to start thinking of Treasure Cruise as an 8-drop.
I don't know what to take from those. The next graph here is like, at least on the 100 Ornithopters, it is a slowly emerging bell curve of win rate distribution, which is just kind of showing you most of the cards are in the middle and some of the cards are on the extremes. This would be Winbury, so if you could like click on it to see what the cards were, I think you can kind of work backwards to get to this information in the like big table down below, but that's that.
I do expect this would eventually converge on a beautiful bell curve of like some particular characteristic for each cube, right? I don't know, maybe some you would see that bell curve would be wider, maybe some would have, I don't know, again, it's like, damn it, now we have these graphs and I just want enough data for them to turn into beautiful smooth curves.
This one, if we had enough data for a bunch of cubes, it'd be very cool to see like, okay, this is like the regular cube where like the power level is really narrow. So there's actually like way more in the middle and like, way fewer on the extremities versus a cube where like the power level is all over the place. Maybe it's closer to like a flat line. You got like a bunch of cards that are pretty awful, a bunch of cards that are really strong.
I don't know if that's even what would happen though, because just because there is this like ideal power level that might be fairly narrow in the regular cube, it might then be that actually those small differences matter tremendously, and like the good players are really able to suss out what are the like important edges, and the players that end up with like the slightly worse removal do a whole lot worse. So it might even be that like that narrow power level results in drastic effect on win percentage. I have no idea, but like I would not be shocked if some of those relationships didn't go in the way you expected.
I think this falls into the category of would be like abstractly very interesting if there were adequate data for a bunch of different cubes, and I'm not convinced any cube has adequate data for this graph to make any sense.
Or I'm talking myself into doing more uploading of decks, because that is a really interesting question.
The next block of this page here is color performance, which is different than win rate by color. Win rate by color is a weighted average of the match win rate of all the cards in that color. Meanwhile, color performance is the actual match record of decks that play each color. So it's interesting to see where this like diverges a little bit from the win rate by color. It like, mostly matches in terms of like the win percentage and in general, but is different in a couple of like small ways, which...
Right, okay. Okay, so this is about the decks, not about the win rate of individual cards, regardless of their context.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So we would see Demonic Tutor contributes to black cards having a high win rate if it,
if it did.
But here we might see if there was a lot of decks that are playing Demonic Tutor, but otherwise are not playing black, then they might not show up here at all.
Honestly, if I were like designing this page, this is probably the table I would put first, because this is just kind of like the raw data. And like, yeah, it's helpful to know that, of the 119 white decks that I have captured here, there's 179 game wins and 165 game losses, or match wins and match losses. A lot of data already in here. Those hard numbers, I think, are maybe sometimes easier to parse than like percentages, which sounds so abstract. Like looking at black, again, it is underperforming. I'm seeing 125 wins, 143 losses. It's like, okay, so for every 12 games you win, you're losing 14. Like you're pretty close to going, even, right? And the variance can make up a lot of things there. I think the draws are particularly interesting here. If you care about, minimizing draws in your cube, you could use this as a way to sort of identify where draws are coming from more often than not.
Oh, that'd be interesting to be able to actually just see these are the cards. Again, draws happen rarely enough that we would need so much data for this to really come through, but saying like, here are the individual cards that appear in decks that have a lot of draws could be interesting.
There's a lot of cool things you could do, and that does come to mind as well. Then we get the first sort of matchup matrix here, and I think I'm going to breeze over this one. This one is just showing the color versus color matchup matrix, and this, I think, does not make a ton of sense because, at least in this cube, very rarely is a deck one color. And so to see that, okay, white beats blue 47.1% of the time, it's like, okay, you're saying every deck that has any white in it beats every deck that has any blue in it slightly less often, like the blue decks are slightly favored or whatever. Multiple layers of abstraction removed from the actual like results that this one feels not particularly useful. But there's one down the page.
It is cool, though. The idea that, we talk a lot about the rock, paper, scissors of aggro mid-range control. There could be other sort of like cycles of, it's not just this deck is better than this other deck, but there is this like complex relationship. And even if I don't know how to draw that much conclusion from this specific, that idea of those complex cyclic rock, paper, scissors patterns is pretty cool to think about. I'm curious to, just think more about that.
Looking at the extremes here is kind of interesting. Like decks with green are absolutely trouncing decks with red, but again, it's like which decks with red, which decks with green. Like if you look at this, you should really only come away with more questions and not like any sense of having answered anything.
No, I think that's a great way to put it because again, like imagine we were looking at a more typical cube here. You could start to put together some hypotheses like, okay, maybe green does good against red because it just has bigger creatures that can like stop aggro threats more effectively. Or maybe white's doing good against blue because blue has an artifact theme and white has access to lots of disenchants. And I think
you could start building hypotheses.
Build hypotheses, ask more questions, not necessarily look at this graph and be like, I understand everything now.
Right, but again, even like that first one you said, where like green's doing better than red because maybe it's got bigger creatures. It's like, well, all those red decks are also all the Jeskai control decks, all the, Grixis control decks. Like those are also red.
And I think that's why this particular cube, it's going to be very cube dependent how much any one of these graphs is going to give you kind of the tools you need because of the complexity of what the types of decks in that environment really look like.
But I find the next couple tables a little more interesting. The next one is just color pair performance. It's the same as color performance, but for every two color pair. And this makes a little more sense to me because very often decks are two colored here. So you're actually seeing, a deck. And we can see at the top of the pile here is Selesnya green-white, both in terms of the number of decks drafted.
Love to see it.
And the win percentage. It is like the best deck in the cube, which is not terribly surprising to me. I think most of the drafts of 100 Ornithopters at these events specifically are among players that have not played it before. And those are the pods where I think it is harder to do an ambitious combo thing because you've never played the cube before. Maybe you don't know the ins and outs of it. And the safest thing to do is put some counters and equipment on your Ornithopters and turn them sideways. And so and then also have interaction. I think green being the color of just level 1, make your creatures bigger, and white being the best
color
card
of
advantage in the cube.
Sure. And white being the color of the best interaction. Like that makes a lot of sense to me.
Which, that's another sort of big asterisk on all this data that we didn't even mention up top. Playing this at a cube event is a very different audience of people than like our regular play group playing this, week in, week out. I think an experience table of people is going to have a very different metagame than, I think on average at a cube event, 4 of the 8 people sitting down maybe have never even looked at the cube list in detail. At CubeCon DMV, multiple people played the cube that had never heard of it before, so they have no idea what's going on. And maybe some people that like listen to the show or have heard me talk about it, or maybe have watched our 6 Studies video, but like that's still really not knowing a lot about a cube. And the cube list has changed a bunch over the years, so I still treat all of this data as like mostly first impression drafts. And I'm not at all surprised to find that in first impression drafts, green-white decks are quite successful, and blue-black decks that are trying to do some combo control are not that successful, even though those are the same kind of decks that Zach Barish regularly just destroys everybody with. And then the next table is, I think, maybe the most interesting because this one is just all the color combinations, period, in terms of their performances and number of decks. So this is where they mix 2-color, 3-color, 4-color, monocolor, and you can see how many decks of each have been drafted into your cube. I really like this table. I think this is one of the more interesting and useful tables. And again, top of the pile here is green-white. And it's interesting, when you look at the color pair, there are 64 green-white decks, and that would be any decks with green and white in them. And when you look at just green-white decks, there's only 18. There's only 18 that are just Selesnya and aren't Abzan or one of the other Naya or one of the other combinations of green-white.
Interesting. So maybe there's less inference than I realized happening here. I thought there was a little bit of, we're going to put things in a color category based on approximate understanding of, if this has a single black card, maybe that doesn't contribute to it being a black deck, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
In the color pair performance or color combination performance?
Color combination performance.
Match record grouped by each deck's exact color identity, not contains, but precisely these colors. So yeah, I think if you have any red cards in your deck, in your white deck, it's now a Boros deck, and it counts as a Boros deck. And as soon as you also have a black card, then it's a Mardu deck, and it's no longer a Boros deck.
That's kind of impressive then that some people, because I'm taking this from when you're building in the deck builder, there's some amount of inference that if you have just a tiny amount of some color, it will still just ignore that.
Maybe that's the case.
So I don't know if there's
sure.
thresholds happening like that here. If it is exact, then it's impressive that there are a number of monocolor decks that have been drafted in this cube.
The monocolor is not that uncommon here. I was surprised to see more mono white than mono black. I thought mono black would be the most popular, but again, I've only imported 2/3 of the data I have access to, and that's just Hadrian Eberk data. I do think probably if you were to add up all the other drafts I've been a party to, mono black does come up pretty often. There's 5 mono black decks here and 6 mono white decks, 3 mono blue decks. I've done that once before. I don't recommend it. It's kind of ambitious. Anyway, I think his table is really good because it is kind of dispensing with a lot of the collapsing and abstracting of information, and instead just, again, there's still this layer, like you mentioned, of kind of okay, how are you actually determining what a Selesnya deck is? If I have Tezzeret's Gambit in my Selesnya deck, am I now a Bant deck? Because that card's not even actually blue. That question, I'm not sure the answer to, and maybe, Gwen could tell us, but that sort of layer of obfuscation aside, this is pretty directly just what colors are people drafting in this cube, what is their win, loss, and draw count. This is interesting where you can start to see, there are 4 Sultai decks responsible for 3 draws. Meanwhile, the 18 Selesnya decks only responsible for 1 draw. So maybe starting to get a sense of what color combinations are actually those decks specifically responsible for draws in the cube. This is interesting. I think it is one of the more useful direct tables of data that you can at least see and understand what's going on. Do you think you can derive anything from this from a cube design perspective? If you let's pretend you're me, you're the designer of the 100 Ornithopters, you're looking at this and seeing that Selesnya, Boros, Abzan, Jeskai are some of the most popular color combinations, and nobody really cares to play Azorius or Gruul or Orzhov. Do you care?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the cube. I think that the number of decks is almost as interesting, if maybe not more interesting, the actual win percentage, just to see that, there's a particular color pair that people just don't want to draft. But again, I would always just tie that back to the ultimate question is, are people having fun at the draft? So if in my cube, nobody is drafting Simic, and nobody is falling into a trap where they think they're going to draft a great Simic deck and then it doesn't come together and they have a bad time. If nobody drafts it and nobody has a bad time because of it, that's kind of fine. So it's I always want to be asking questions based on the actual gameplay, and then I definitely do think that this data could be useful to support it. If I went in and saw, I hear people grumbling, and then I go look at this table and see, yeah, a lot of people are trying this and has a really low win percentage, maybe that's a place to start building a compelling narrative to make some changes.
I think it tells me a lot about gold cards, too. I recently added Hindering Light to 100 Ornithopters, which is a blue-white counterspell that can only counter a spell that targets you or a permanent you control, but then also draws a card. And seeing that only 3 people in this entire 200 deck pool drafted exactly blue-white, drafted Azorius, does make me realize that, neither of the blue-white cards I have are, big draws to be blue-white. If you were, playing white and you saw Hindering Light, you're not heck yeah, I'm playing blue-white now. You probably don't care. You probably have to already be in that color combination to want that card. And there's just not a really compelling reason to just be blue-white when you can be Jeskai. And, I have Triumphs in this cube. So I think 3-color decks are more appealing than they would be absent those triomes. And so Jeskai is a very established color combination because there's a whole combo in the sort of Jeskai Ascendancy deck, which is quite successful in this data set. You could look at my blue-white cards and say, do you want to play this in a Jeskai Ascendancy deck? Okay, if not, next flowchart question, is this card good enough to warrant a deck of its own? And if the answer to that is also no, then it's like, does this really have a home here? Is there kind of, putting a card in here that doesn't actually really have a home? And maybe that's the case with a Hindering Light, for example. All right, the next places where we start to get really, I think, detailed and go super deep, the Archetype Map. A lot of stuff to parse here. So what this section does is it tries to group all the decks in your cube into some number of named archetypes based off of machine learning, AI, whatever you want to call it. I can tell you this number changes depending on the data. So it's not like it's always fitting them to in this case, I have 9, or is it 10? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 9 right now, but I'm telling you, it's not always fitting them to 9. If the algorithm determines that actually there's 12 or actually there's 6 different archetypes, it kind of will choose different numbers. And then it will show you a map of how those archetypes relate to each other, which frankly, I don't think is particularly useful.
In my tiny sample for regular cube, you can either draft Mardu Aristocrats or 4-color control. Those are the 2 options.
Yeah, this is where I mentioned earlier. So the highest win percentage deck here is what they're calling Bant Ramp. But again, there's not really a ramp deck here. And if you look at the identity cards for this,
right, that goes
deck,
a long way to sort of describing what this particular cluster is all about.
Yeah, you can click on a cluster and then see staple cards, identity cards. I don't know what the difference between staple cards and identity cards are. I'm guessing staples are just the most common cards in those deck lists, and identities are the most unique to those deck lists. Anyway, I'm looking at, Winged Portent, Bow of Nylea, Metallic Rebuke, Twisted Image, Rebuild, and a bunch of fixing lands. That's control. That is what a control deck looks like in this cube. It's from these cards it looks like. And you can actually just go through and click on the decks too and see, the Simic Ramp deck that has a 3-0. And it's all right, you're actually just a control deck, basically. Actually, you can see here from what's being classified as a Bant Ramp deck. This deck has Vandal Blast, Chiron Negotiations, Quicksilver Dagger in it, and is being called a Bant Ramp deck. So another sort of indication to take all of this with a huge grain of salt, because that's not a Bant deck. So things are being averaged and normalized here in ways that could be potentially confusing and complicated. But I think it is interesting to be able to see how it thinks these decks break down. I think it's interesting that this blue-based splashing white and green control deck has the highest win percentage, but the most trophies is attributable to this, what they're calling white-green counters deck. That's probably pretty close to it. There's a lot of plus-1 counters, so that's a pretty accurate name, I would say. And then Mardu Combo is the lowest win percentage archetype here with 42.7 win percentage of match win percentage, but has 4 trophies to its name, which is tied for the second most amongst all of the archetypes, which as a cube designer, I feel pretty good about. That tells me that this deck is not undersupported, it's not bad, it's just that maybe it is somewhat complicated to play or tricky to draft and get all the right pieces. And so capable players are able to do it and get a trophy, and your average player is going 1-2 with it because they didn't quite make it all sing perfectly. That is a thing that I'm totally fine to see. Interesting sort of things to note here. So again, the 2 most successful color combinations from the color combination performance table are Selesnya and Boros, white-green and white-red. White-red decks, though, actually have no trophies to their name and a pretty low win percentage. The second most drafted deck with 12 decks, but a win percentage of 45.7 and not a single trophy in white-red in this particular data set, which is interesting because it seems like white-green is very successful, Naya is very successful, green-red basically never gets played, which is kind of interesting. And again, that to me is a gold card thing, right? There are really good red-white and green-white gold cards, and there just doesn't happen to be a good red-green gold card. I think the red-green cards, when put together, can be perfectly successul, but you're not going to find yourself in that deck very often because you'll start in one color, and then you'll see an amazing gold card, and that'll be a reason to be a second color. You're not going to start in in order to end up in red-green, you have to start in one color, and then see a huge monocolored bomb in the other color, and then not see enough fixing or a reason to splash a good gold card across any of these combinations, basically.
I think it's interesting comparing just the graph portion of this to the very first thing, which is just that color balance. The color balance, okay, maybe that's something that abstractly makes sense and you would want to have that be fairly narrow, but really isn't telling you the whole story. This tells a much more compelling narrative of okay, what are the actual types of decks that people are drafting? But on the other hand, it's also much more indirect because there is this layer of analysis that is grouping things that maybe isn't grouping things in the way that you think about the cube. So I think there's more compelling narrative here, but it's great that we also have all the details that you can actually dive in and be okay, what are the actual decks that are being categorized in this way, and does that actually tell the story that I'm interested in taking from this? And you can go really, really deep in this section. Like, literally, here's
everything,
all the specific
you can click
decks
on everything and then see, like, the whole deck list. So, yeah, it is nice to sort of dive in deep on. The next thing is, I think, something that I'm excited to see get more populated as I continue to upload more data. This is the matchup matrix for those aforementioned archetypes. So it's a 9x9 grid, 81 individual matchup breakdowns, basically. I guess the mirror match makes sense. You can play the mirror match, obviously. And here we see some interesting patterns. For example, that Bant control deck, which they're calling Bant Ramp here, has a very strong matchup against Naya Stompy is what is the archetype here, which basically saying, like, if you've got blue cards in your deck, if you're playing Echoing Truth and Hercule's Recall and some counter spells, you're probably pretty good against, like, the Naya Fair Stuff deck with a 75% win percentage across 8 matchups. Small numbers. We're talking really small numbers here, but 8 matchups, 6 of them were won by the Bant control deck. You know, if you and I sat down with 2 decks and played 8 matches and I won 6 of them, some of those games are going to be mana screws, some of them are going to be variants. We don't know anything about the pilots of these decks. There could just be a big delta in, like, the skill of the pilot.
Well, in that example, we do know the skill of the pilots, but...
Yeah, we know you're better than me. I get it. We can check the big Cube Cobra rankings.
Not
it's
even
fine.
true.
But I still think that, like, winning 6 out of 8 is notable, right? Like, it's anecdotally notable to, like, be aware of that. And that's something I would, again, kind of have expected there. There's a couple cells here where, like, the matchup is just never played. Looks like the Naya Mirror has never been played. The Naya Stompy deck's never played another Naya Stompy deck, which that's a little more reasonable. Like, in the same pod to have 2 players be in that 3-color combo, maybe harder to pull off.
But also, I think your first inclination was right. Those don't make sense in the fact that they're always going to be 50%, except that they're not in one case. So I'm curious what's going on there.
It is very weird to me that for some reason
maybe
the first
draws are factoring into it in an asymmetrical way.
The mirror matches are all 50%, except for, in the case of my in particular draft, that blue control deck only has a 37.5 win percentage, which
against itself
has to be draws. That's the only thing it could be. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. You should come up with all this with more questions to ask and no sense of having, like, answered anything would be my, like, advice, basically.
But like the same matchup matrix for colors, I think this does the same thing, but in a way that, again, has a much more clear narrative that you can apply to it and start to see things like, oh yeah, the control deck beats the aggro deck, or whatever is the opposite that's supposed to happen. Who can say? Or like, yeah,
in this case, who can say for sure?
In this case, the deck that has a bunch of disenchants is going to beat the deck that is based on a bunch of enchantments and things like that, because things are labeled in a way that is more human to the way we think about different types of decks.
So I'm still taking it with a big grain of salt, and this is, like, still not quite enough data for me to start to feel like any of this is more than just noise in most of these cells. But as I continue to add more data for this, I'm excited to see how this sort of shakes out. And I'm especially interested in, like, what I can learn from this, given that this is such a weird cube. Like, you kind of alluded to the basic rock, paper, scissors of, like, you know, mid-range beats aggro and control beats mid-range and aggro beats control. I don't think anything like that can possibly even come close to being said to apply here. And so, like, I'm kind of curious to, like, get a sense of, is there a sort of cyclical meta in terms of what decks beat other decks? I have some ideas, but I'm not firm in any of those assumptions, and this would be something I would refer to kind of, like, again, tell me which questions to ask, basically. Which things to search for explanations for. That is an archetype performance table. There's a reputation versus reality, which is maybe the thing I will caution people to give any attention to, because this is basically a graph of how decks win rates compared to the bots ELO for where they should take them in drafts, which, if anything, just tells you about what the bots are bad at and not at all what is, like, actually good in your cube in any way that is useful. So this big sort of scatter plot of all the cards mapped on, you know, Cube Cobra draft ELO versus match ELO. Sorry, I know it's not ELO.
Good catch. Yeah, I mean, this is, if anything, maybe just shows you, like, how different is this cube from other cubes, because you're comparing the ELO, which is based on how highly people take the cards in simulated drafts, across all cubes, which makes it muddy, right? I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
I don't know what it is. I couldn't tell you.
So to see, like, oh, this has a Gavany Township, normally not a very good card, but is very, very, like, shows up in a much more winning decks here, I think.
Kind of.
Match ELO, high, Cobra Draft ELO. Damn it.
They're going to get us in the comments.
It's fine. I won't read them. So I think there is something interesting to be seen here, but it is less directly useful and more of just a curiosity of how is your cube unique compared to others.
Then there's just a, link to all the 3.0 deck lists if you want, which is fine. And then there's this sort of summary tables of overperformers.
Well, you say fine. This actually, for many players, might be, like, the most useful thing to jump first to. If you're just interested in how to, like, do well at a cube, jump into the trophy case is probably a good idea.
Yeah, again, I like that it's not abstracted. It's just, here are the decks.
Right.
And there's a couple I'm excited to have finally documented that I lived in my head, where I watched somebody trophy with this deck, but I never bothered to write down the actual deck list that I pulled now from Hedron Network, and so I'm excited to have those documented. Then you get these tables of top 8 over under performers, most played, and trophy leaders.
What do you think the most played card in this cube is?
It is Ornithopter, yes. It is in all 25 of the trophy decks that are in this 25 draft sample.
I appreciate that the card hovers even have the tags and specific uploaded card imagery that you have for this cube. That's a nice touch.
That is a nice thing. The overperformers and underperformers here are different than the reputation versus reality. This has nothing to do with the draft elo. This is just highest match elo versus the performance of the strength of the opposition. So it's performance versus the strength of the opposition faced. Yeah, these are just the cards that the way that elo is calculated, you can go read about on Wikipedia or whatever. It has to do with not just whether you win or lost, but the strength of your opponent. And so that's taken into account here. We can see that the best card in 100 Ornithopters, not close. Obviously, everyone's pack one, pick one, Springleaf Drum.
That's a little surprising, but gonna make me think.
I'm not terribly surprised by this because I think this kind of goes back to Jet's article, right? Springleaf Drum is the kind of card that I think good players can recognize that it's really strong here. It's basically a 1-mana rock that taps for any color, and then also has combo applications in both Paradox Engine decks as well as Jeskai Ascendancy decks. It's this generically good mana-fixing card that also has outs to be a key piece of a combo. I'm not surprised that this is the kind of card that maybe good players recognize and take more highly than players that are less experienced or don't know this environment, or maybe just don't have the card evaluation chops to sort of recontextualize things. I'm a little surprised Gavany Township is so high. Curse of Predation, Rite of Harmony, Obelisk Aver. This is just evidence of that green-white deck being good. And you can see these are the cards that the green-white deck plays and plays exclusively. That's why these cards rank highly. Underperformers: Ashnod's Altar, Bantu's Monument, Thrumming Stone, Echoing Return, Organ Harvest, Faith's Reward, Second Sunrise, No Rest for the Wicked. Again, that to me is not these 8 cards are bad. That to me is saying the deck that relies on these cards is underperforming, and that is true. Echoing Return is broken in this cube. Echoing Return is so much better than Springleaf Drum. It's crazy in this environment. This is not to say that card is bad, but the decks that are playing it a lot and using it to try and go off with their altars and Bantu's Monument and do a bunch of stuff, that's some of the most ambitious, clunky combos that, as we addressed earlier, 4 trophies to their name, but a pretty low overall win percentage because it is easy to have that deck fall flat. What do I take away from this? I think I'm fine having the sort of black sacrifice deck be more complicated to play, require a little more skill or luck or, things to go right in the draft. I don't think that's inherently a bad thing about the deck. I do wonder if some people are playing these cards for value and not for combo, and that's where they're going wrong. They're I'm just going to no rest for the wicked in case my opponent has a board wipe, and it's that's not really what you should be doing with the card. You should be using that to recur 8 Ornithopters on your turn where you have Goblin Bombardment and, Pia's Revolution. That's what the card is meant for. But this, again, overperformers and underperformers are just a sort of proxy for the decks that are good, not that card is good. Springleaf Drum is interesting because it doesn't go in necessarily one specific deck per se. I mean, it does have those combo applications, but you can kind of play it in any deck compared to Gavany Township and Rite of Harmony, which go very specifically in a green-white deck.
Yeah, I kind of think these tables are a little bit more of a novelty, but
yeah, I agree.
Again, I wonder how these would look with different cubes.
I'm going to skip Top Synergies and Card Deep Dive right now because I think
Top Synergies is very funny.
It's funny.
No, I think we should look at
It's funny because it doesn't exclude lands, so...
The way to win, the best synergy in the entire cube is, everybody knows, Paradox Outcome, pair it with Windswept Teeth.
I mean, yeah. That's
what I like to do.
It means you're playing green and white cards and you have Paradoxical Outcome in your deck. That's a good strategy. You're doing a great job. Yeah, I think the fact that this includes lands makes it a little funny, and the card Deep Dive is especially funny because it took me a long time to realize that it just defaults to the most played card, which is Ornithopter, and so in this cube, it's what are the best cards to pair with Ornithopter? I mean, you mean all of the cards in the cube because every card is paired with Ornithopter? That's kind of a little funny. I do think the play rate is interesting. There's only 3 cards that have shown up in main decks of every draft I've uploaded, all 25. It's Ornithopter, Mox Opal, and Bantu's Monument. Some of that is that these are across multiple years where some cards were just not included in the cube for all the events. But mostly it just means that, somebody is sideboarding Sensei's Divining Top or, you would think the fetch lands would show up all the time. But again, this could also come down to the cleanliness of the data, having people didn't take a deck pick or, I didn't, capture the auto, photo capture, didn't get all the cards. But that's the interesting thing to think about, at least. But I think jumping down to the all cards table, which allows you to sort of look at overperformers and underperformers in their full context, is maybe the most interesting thing. You can just download a CSV to play with this in your own software if you want. But this does let you see the play rate for all the cards. And play rate is the thing I definitely care about a lot. And looking at cards here that have not been recently added, because there are a lot of cards that have a low play rate that were just very recently added to the cube, but ones that have been there for a long time that still have a really low play rate are cards like Molten Slag Heap. This is a storage land. I play storage lands in the 100 Ornithopters cube, just a couple of them. Storage lands, they tap for a colorless. You can pay one and tap them, put a storage counter on them, and you can pay one and remove X storage counters from the land to add X mana, any combination of 2 colors. So it's like really slow mana fixing, or this like slow ramp where you can basically build up a bunch of storage counters and then take them off to get a bunch of mana in one turn. And I added a couple of these when I noticed that there were a lot of games that were just kind of like players staring at each other, passing back and forth turn over turn, because they were waiting to sort of assemble all the pieces they needed for their combo in their hand or for their synergy in their hand to go off, because when you can play all your creatures for 0 mana, there's no reason to do anything on board until you need to. And I figured giving players a way to like dump a bunch of mana and like have a mana sink basically to just like build up for that big turn might be really useful. I think actually Julian suggested these lands too based on that same play pattern. But I'm not surprised to see them here in the least played cards, because I think often players just don't, especially again, players that are not familiar with this meta, playing this cube for the first time at an event. They're like, why do I have the worst black-red fixing land ever? Even in my black-red deck, I'm not going to play Molten Slag Heap. Like, I've considered just swapping those lands out for more Ravnica bounce lands, which I think have a kind of similar role. I mean, they're not mana sinks, obviously, but they come into play tapped and draw you a card. They're these like slow lands you want if you're like taking a long time to set up and you have time to play all the other lands you put back, bounce back to your hand. But they're so much more recognizable for players that I think they would just see play, where the Molten Slag Heap of the world and the Dreadship Reef are just not seeing play that much.
And I would just underscore that this data is about what players are doing with the cards, not about objectively which cards are the best.
For sure, yes. And that's something we should just keep restating, because that is definitely true. Are there any things that surprise you in this data you want to like call out specifically? I should say too, by the time this episode comes out, I will probably have done a whole video of like talking about the actual results for 100 Ornithopters in more detail. We're talking about kind of the results abstractly here, but I'm going to go through and like talk about this for that cube specifically as a YouTube video. So check out the YouTube channel if you want to see that. But in terms of like understanding this abstractly for like how players could use this or cube designers could use this themselves, what are you looking at in this table, if anything?
That's a little bit hard for me to say just because you've thought so much about this cube and have like a lot of specific expectations and narratives. I have not as much. I will say just from my little bit that I did uploading decks for regular cube, I kind of learned a little bit just from doing the exercise of looking more carefully at the decks. Yeah. And I think that I kind of have this idea of most decks here are 2 colors and 2 colors and a splash. And even that just like baseline assumption, I'm just like, wait a minute, is it really? Because I keep seeing decks that are playing either just like straight 3 colors or like a splash that seems surprising to me. Just a color combination I don't think of as being something that I'm really interested in as a player of that cube. So that's the kind of thing where I'd be like, okay, that's kind of counter to my expectations. I would love to get some more data in here to then actually look at, is that true? Does the data support the fact that my expectation is wrong there? That's obviously like the most basic thing that this data can tell us, and I'm sure going through more of those sort of like discrepancies with my expectations would pop up.
I do think if you're a cube designer and you haven't taken time to look at people's decks they've drafted completely anecdotally just to like learn how people like look at your cube and draft it, you learn a lot just from seeing the cards people put in their sideboard, didn't take highly for their deck because they didn't think they wanted it or need it. Something I find from newer cube designers all the time is I think they really overstate and overestimate their ability to estimate what an average player is going to do. You should basically treat average players as like a chaos muppet, because you really are quite far off in what they're actually doing. I learned this early on when I was, after the very first CubeCon that 100 Ornithopters was at, whatever one that was, I was going through the deck list pretty fastidiously and trying to reconstruct them. And there were a couple where I didn't have a deck photo, and I was like, I can build this deck. I can see which like off-color cards they wouldn't cut, and like, and I'll just like do my best to build this deck. And then in a couple cases, I later on got in touch with the person and was able to get a deck photo, and it was just like completely wrong. And I was like, you played this color and not this color? Like, you have twice as many cards and they seem better and your fixing's better, but you instead play this completely different color. Like, players just do things that you would not expect because this is a really complicated game and it's really difficult to put yourself in the shoes of somebody with different biases and perspectives.
So true. I mean, some players are out there and they'll just like draft blue decks. Like what?
Love to
so
do it.
Weird.
In summary, this is a lot of fun stuff to look at. I think it's interesting and novel and kind of like, can cause you to like ask some questions. But I do think that all of this you should take with a big grain of salt for all the reasons we mentioned, and treat it as a seed to what questions you should be asking, and then seek good explanations for those things, right? Like, I think I can explain why black decks struggle here, and it's because they're basically 4-card combo decks that also need enough Ornithopters to like go off, and that's just harder to make happen than putting one Ornithopter in play and putting a Bow and Sabers on it and attacking turn over turn. Like, that's just a more easy thing to do. So figuring out what questions you should be asking to better understand your environment. Like, I think you should have a hypothesis for why these numbers are what they are, which is not to say that like there is any objective best way for them to be, right? Like, I don't think you should strive for balance across everything perfectly in your cube necessarily, but being able to say like, yeah, it makes sense that these decks are successful in this context and for these reasons, and here are the reasons why I think these other decks might struggle, is good to know.
And it is very fun to look at graphs.
By the time this episode comes out, hopefully I will have another 100 or so deck lists in the 100 Ornithopters cube for you to look at. If you have done this for your own cube and have, bigger archival data and have more than 300 decks in your cube, let us know. I want to check out your win rate analysis page too, so I can see what it looks like for other cube environments. And I don't know, maybe I'll hire an intern to do this for all the Bun Magic cube drafts and Sacred Geometry cube drafts and all the other cube stuff. It's just so much work. On that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and this podcast is edited by Matthew. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards. I've been speaking to microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of cube.
Thank you for going through the process of categorizing so many decks so we could talk about graphs.
Yeah, graphs.
Now it's time to see whose cube is better.
Whose cube is better?
Objectively.